They laughed the first day he dragged the ladder inside, and it was the kind of laughter meant to be shared. It was sharp, confident, the sound people make when they believe they witnessing something obviously foolish. The ladder scraped against the rough plank floor as he tilted it upright, the metal feet leaving pale scars in the wood. Outside, the air carried that dry, biting cold that came before real winter, the kind that warned you what was coming without yet doing its worst. The cabin itself was barely more than a square box set into the edge of the trees. Pine boards nailed together by hand, seams visible, gaps stuffed with whatever scraps he managed to find. No paint, no insulation anyone would recognize. When the wind blew, you could hear it moving through the walls like something breathing. The roof sloped low, just high enough to stand under in the center before forcing your neck to bend. It was meant to be comfortable. It was meant to exist. People in town called it temporary, even though he'd been living there for over a year. They gathered in the doorway and along the frozen path, boots crunching on old snow, hands shoved deep into coat pockets. Someone leaned against the doorframe, grinning like they'd already won an argument that hadn't even started yet. "What's that for?" one of them asked, nodding at the ladder. He did answer right away. He set the ladder carefully beneath the rafters, adjusted the angle, tested it with his weight. The wood above creaked softly, but it held. Everything in the cabin made small sounds, like that tiny protest reminding you how close failure always was. "I am building a bed," he said finally. They waited, expecting more. "A bed," he repeated, glancing upward. "Up there." The laughter came fast then. One man snorted outright. Another shook his head like he'd just seen proof that stubbornness could rot a person's brain. Someone muttered something about cabin fever arriving early. "There's barely room for squirrels up there," a woman said. "You trying to freeze faster?" Another added, "That heat, I'll leak right out." Someone else said with certainty, "You build into the roof unless you want to sleep cold." He listened without reacting, because arguing had never helped him much. He learned that people did. To really want explanations, they wanted confirmation of what they already believed. And what they believed was that cold lived everywhere equally, that winter pressed down from the sky and rose up from the ground at the same time, and that survival was about fighting it head-on with bigger fires and thicker boots. They did see the way he watched the smoke drift upward every night. The cabin had one small wood stove squatting in the corner like an exhausted animal. He fed it constantly, especially after sunset, splitting logs until his shoulders burned, stacking them near the door so he would. He'd have to step outside every time the fire dropped. Still, the warmth never seemed to last. The moment the fire softened, cold slid across the floorboards, creeping under blankets, biting toes first, then ankles, then knees. Sleep came in short stretches, broken by shivering and the need to wake and feed the stove again. But every time he stood up from the floor, he noticed the same thing. The air near the ceiling was different. It was taut. Not exactly, but it was softer. It did. Stabbed the lungs when you breathed it in. When he climbed onto a chair to fix a loose beam weeks earlier, he'd been surprised by how quickly his fingers stopped aching once they were higher up. It was magic. It was simple, quiet physics doing what it had always done, unnoticed, because no one bothered to look up. "Heat rises," he said now, finally meeting their eyes. Someone laughed again. "That's for proper houses," they said. "With insulation, with sealed walls. Not for this thing." The thing, as they called it, shuddered slightly as a gust of wind hit the side. Snow dust slid from the roof and whispered down the boards. He placed a hand flat against the wall, feeling the cold press inward like a living force. "This thing leaks heat like a sieve." Another voice chimed in, "You'll lose whatever little warmth you've got." He nodded slowly. That's exactly the problem. They did understand what he meant by that, and he did try to clarify. He knew how it sounded. He knew how it looked, some half-frozen man planning to sleep inches from the roof in a cabin that already struggled to stay warm. To them, it was backwards, almost insulting, like he was tempting winter to punish him harder. What they did, see, was how tired he was of losing. He'd grown up here. He knew what January did to people who underestimated it. He'd seen strong houses crack and better-built homes fail. He'd watched families pack up and leave after one winter too many, convinced the land itself had rejected them. The cold did. Care how confident you were. It only cared whether you respected its rules. And one of those rules was simple. Warm air did. Belong on the floor. He waited until they left before he started working in earnest. The sun dipped early now, shadows stretching long across the snow. Inside the cabin, the light faded to a dull amber glow that made the rough boards look older than they were. He climbed the ladder again, this time carrying a short plank balanced carefully on one shoulder. The attic space was, too, meant for people. It had never been finished because no one had planned for it to matter. Dust clung to everything. Old nails stuck out at odd angles. The rafters were close enough together that he had to move slowly, shifting his weight with care. So he did. T slipped through and break a leg or worse. He laid the plank across 2 joists and pressed down, testing it. It flexed slightly but did T crack. He exhaled and reached for another board. Each movement was deliberate. Every sound felt loud in the quiet cabin. Hammer blows echoed like gunshots. His breath fogged the air below him, but up near the roof, it faded faster. He noticed that too. By the time full darkness settled outside, he delayed enough boards to outline the shape of a narrow sleeping platform. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't pretty. But it existed, and that was enough to keep him going. He climbed down slowly, joints aching, hands stiff with cold and splinters. The stove had burned low while he worked, the fire reduced to dull embers. Cold rushed back in to claim the floor, sharp and immediate. He stood there for a long moment, looking up at the rough shape taking form above his head. People thought winter defeated you all at once, in storms and blizzards and dramatic moments. But he knew better. Winter wore you down quietly, night by night, stealing sleep, draining strength, convincing you to give up inch by inch. This was his way of stealing something back. Tomorrow, they would laugh again when they saw the boards. The day after that, maybe they'd stop laughing and just shake their heads. By the time real winter arrived, they would be watching anymore. They'd be too busy fighting the cold the way they always had. He banked the stove for the night, wrapped himself in blankets, and lay down on the floor one last time. Cold pressed through the boards, sharp as ever, crawling into his bones. Above him, unseen in the dark, warm air gathered uselessly beneath the roof. He closed his eyes, already knowing that would last forever. The attic once meant for people, and the first time he climbed up there with the intention of staying, it made that fact painfully clear. The space greeted him with dust that clung to his eyelashes and throat, with splinters that waited patiently for bare skin, with the low, oppressive weight of a roof that felt far too close to his head. He had to crouch the moment his boots left the ladder, his back instinctively hunching as if the cabin itself were telling him he did. Belonged there. This was a forgotten space. Not abandoned exactly, because abandonment implies intention but ignored. Built only because roofs needed something to sit on and ceilings needed something above them. The joists ran across the cabin like ribs, uneven in spacing, each one a reminder that this place had been raised quickly, with survival in mind, not comfort or future plans. There was no flooring, no insulation, no neat boundaries, just open gaps where a single misstep could send him crashing down onto the table or stove below. He paused there longer than he expected, one knee braced against a beam, one hand gripping the rough wood. The air up here felt stale, untouched by the daily movements of living. It smelled like old pine sap and cold dust, like something sealed away from time. For a brief moment, doubt crept in, not the loud kind people talked about, but the quiet kind that asked practical questions. How much weight would this really hold? What if the boards shifted in the night? What if he woke up halfway through winter buried in broken wood and shame? Below him, the cabin sighed as a gust of wind pressed against its walls. Snow tapped lightly against the roof, a sound he'd come to recognize as winter clearing its throat. He climbed back down, gathered his tools, and brought them up one by one. A small stack of reclaimed boards leaned against the wall below, scavenged from a collapse shed months earlier. Each board bore scars, old nail holes, weather cracks, dark stains from years of exposure. He preferred them that way. New wood had a tendency to lie, to pretend it was stronger than it really was. Old wood told the truth. He measured the distance between the strongest joists twice before laying anything down. His fingers moved slowly, numb from the cold, but steady. Every decision mattered here. He was building furniture. He was building trust between himself and gravity. The first board went down with a hollow sound, echoing faintly through the cabin. He pressed on it with his knee, then his foot, then stood fully upright. It bowed slightly but did. Complained. He stayed there for a long moment, feeling the way his weight distributed itself, listening for cracks that never came. Outside, someone passed by. He heard the crunch of boots, the low murmur of voices. He imagined them glancing at the cabin, seeing the faint light through the window, wondering what new foolishness he was up to now. He ignored it. The attic demanded attention. It punished distraction. As the platform grew, board by board, the space began to change. Not physically, nothing about it became larger or brighter, but psychologically. It stopped feeling like a void and started feeling like a destination. Somewhere between the third and fourth plank, he realized he was smiling. Not because the work was easy or pleasant, but because it felt right in a way few things had lately. The cold still lived up here, but it behaved differently. It wasn't aggressive. It hovered instead, a passive presence rather than an invading force. When he paused to rest, sitting cross-legged on the new boards, he noticed that his breath did fog as thickly as it did below. His ears did ache the way they usually did when he stayed still too long. It was warm, but it was kinder. That night, he did sleep in the attic yet. He was ready. The platform needed reinforcing, and he needed time to learn its sounds. Instead, he climbed down and sat near the stove, rubbing warmth back into his hands. The fire crackled softly, throwing light upward, and he watched the glow vanish into the darkness above the ceiling line. All that heat, he thought, just sitting there. The next morning he woke to frost on the inside of the window. The floor felt like stone beneath his feet, and his breath came out in thick white clouds. He fed the stove, waited for the air to soften, then climbed the ladder again before the cabin fully warmed. He wanted to feel the attic as it truly was, not as an extension of the fire. The cold greeted him, but again it did bite the way it did below. He worked for hours, reinforcing weak spots, adding cross-bracing, making sure the boards rested evenly across the joists. He moved with care, but not fear. Fear made mistakes. Respect made precision. By midday, he had a solid platform wide enough for a narrow mattress and a small space beside it to sit. He lay down flat for the first time, staring up at the underside of the roof boards just inches from his face. The closeness was startling. Every knot in the wood stood out. Tiny gaps let slivers of daylight through, thin as needles. Snowmelt dripped faintly somewhere far above. He raised a hand and pressed it against the roof. Cold. Deep cold. The kind that did change easily, but the air around his chest, his legs, his feet, it was different. Subtly, unmistakably different. He lay there long enough to let his body register it, to let the instinctive tension ease. He laughed then, quietly, the sound muffled by the low ceiling. People would say this was dangerous, that he was risking collapse, suffocation, stupidity. They'd say he was overthinking something simple, that all he needed was more firewood, thicker socks, better luck. But luck had never kept anyone warm through winter. That afternoon, a neighbor stopped by unannounced. The knock came sharp and loud, startling him into banging his head lightly against a beam. He swore under his breath and climbed down, rubbing the spot. The neighbor stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots, glancing around with casual curiosity. "Heard you were building something strange up there," he said, nodding toward the ceiling. "Strange? Relative," he replied. The man squinted up, then laughed. "You serious about sleeping there?" He did answer. He grabbed the ladder, leaned it back into place, and climbed halfway up. "Stick your hand up here," he said. The neighbor hesitated, then shrugged and followed, stopping just below the platform. He reached up cautiously, palm open. The laughter stopped. "Well?" he asked. The man frowned, flexed his fingers. "Fees warmer than it should." He nodded. "It is." The neighbor did argue. He climbed back down quietly, boots thudding heavier than before. "Still seems risky," he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Not disbelief, something closer to curiosity. "Hope it holds." "So do I," he replied, and meant it. That night, he carried his bedding up the ladder piece by piece. The mattress was thin and awkward, bending as he pushed it into place, but it fit. He tucked it against the roof slope, laid his blanket on top, then climbed down one last time to bank the fire. The ladder felt steeper when he climbed it again in the dark. The attic felt smaller, closer. He lay down, heart beating a little faster than usual, listening to the cabin settle around him. Wood popped softly as temperatures dropped outside. Wind pressed against the walls, searching for weaknesses. He waited for the cold to claim him. It did. The air around him warmed gradually, almost imperceptibly, like a hand slowly closing around his body. His breath stayed clear. His feet did. Numb. For the first time since winter had begun whispering its threats, he felt something close to comfort. Below him, the floor froze solid. He slept deeper than he had in months, wrapped in heat that had always been there, just waiting for someone to climb up and claim it. The ladder creaked under his weight in a way that made him pause halfway up. Not because he feared it would break. He detested it enough times to trust it, but because the sound felt louder at night, magnified by the quiet. Darkness changed everything. During the day, the cabin was a place of work, of motion and noise and purpose. At night, it became something else entirely, a fragile bubble of warmth surrounded by a cold that pressed in from all sides, patient and relentless. He climbed the rest of the way slowly, careful not to rush. The attic greeted him with the same low ceiling and close air, but now there was a mattress waiting, a blanket folded at the edge, proof that this wasn't an experiment anymore. This was where he intended to sleep. For a moment, he just sat there, legs dangling over the edge of the platform, boots resting against the ladder rung. Below him, the stove gave off a dull orange glow, its fire already banked low for the night. He could hear the wind outside, stronger now, sliding across the roof like a hand testing the lid of a box. This was the point of no return. If this failed, if he froze, or the boards shifted, or the heat vanished the moment the fire died, there would be no one to blame but himself. He imagined the laughter if word got out that he crawled back down in the middle of the night, defeated by his own idea. He pulled his boots off and placed them carefully beside the mattress. The wood beneath his bare feet was cool, but not punishing. That alone surprised him. On the floor, even with thick socks, the cold had a way of biting instantly, sharp and personal. Up here, it felt distant, muted, like it had lost interest. He lay down on his back and stared at the roof boards inches from his face. The knots in the wood looked like eyes in the dim light, watching him, judging. He could trace the grain patterns with his gaze, follow cracks that had formed long before he arrived. Somewhere above, snow shifted and slid, making the roof groan softly. His first instinct was to pull the blanket tight around his shoulders, bracing himself. Years of winter had taught his body to expect discomfort, to tense against it before it arrived. He waited for the familiar ache in his joints, the slow creep of numbness starting at his toes. Instead, nothing happened. Minutes passed. Then more. His breath stayed steady, no clouds forming in front of his face. The air around his chest felt held. Not hot, not stuffy, but gently warm, like the space inside a coat after you've been walking for a while. The contrast was so unexpected that he shifted slightly, half expecting the warmth to vanish if he acknowledged it. It did. Below him, the fire popped once, then settled. He listened carefully, attuned to every sound. The cabin made its usual nighttime noises wood contracting, a faint whistle where wind found a crack but nothing alarming, no splintering, no sudden shifts. The platform held, solid and quiet beneath him. He closed his eyes, not to sleep yet, but to feel. To let his body register what his mind was still hesitant to believe. The difference was unmistakable. It wasn't subtle anymore. Up here, the cold had lost its authority. He laughed softly, the sound swallowed by the low ceiling. It was a triumphant laugh. It was quieter than that, edged with relief. The kind of laugh that came after a long stretch of doubt, finally loosened its grip. He slept. Not the light, broken sleep winter usually allowed, where every noise dragged him back to consciousness and every hour ended with stiff limbs and aching bones. This was deeper. He drifted without noticing the moment it happened, sank into it like water closing over his head. When he woke, it was still dark. For a brief, disorienting moment, he forgot where he was. The closeness of the ceiling confused him. The unfamiliar warmth made him think he was dreaming. Then he remembered, and his heart kicked hard in his chest. He lay still, listening. The stove below was quiet now. No crackle, no glow, just a faint metallic tick as it cooled. Outside, the wind had strengthened, howling low and constant, a sound that usually meant trouble. He flexed his toes under the blanket, expecting stiffness. They moved easily. He sat up slowly, careful not to hit his head, and swung his legs over the edge of the mattress. Warm air clung to him as he moved, reluctant to let go. He reached for the ladder and climbed down, each rung colder than the last. The floor hit him like a slap. Cold surged up through the soles of his feet, sharp enough to steal his breath. He hissed and grabbed the table to steady himself, shocked by the contrast. The air down here felt heavy and hostile, every surface coated in cold that had settled while he slept undisturbed above it. He stood there, barefoot, stunned. The difference was to imagined. It was to wishful thinking or temporary luck. It was dramatic, clear, undeniable. He hurried to the wall where he dehung the thermometer earlier that evening. The red line sat low, just above freezing. He grabbed a second thermometer. He de-tied to a cord and pulled it down from the attic beam. The number made him blink. He checked again, rubbed frost from the glass, leaned closer. The reading did change. The air above was more than 50 degrees warmer than the air hugging the floor. He let out a long breath he hadn't. T realized he'd been holding. By the time he climbed back up, the warmth returned almost immediately, wrapping around him like he never left. He lay back down, this time without tension, without bracing. Sleep came again, just as deep. Morning arrived quietly. Pale light filtered through the tiny window, barely touching the attic space, but enough to signal the end of night. He woke rested. Something he hadn't. T felt in so long it took him a moment to recognize it. He climbed down carefully, boots back on now, and went straight to the door. When he opened it, cold rushed in like an insult. The world outside was locked in ice, snow crusted hard. trees frozen mid-sway. Smoke rose from chimneys across the valley, thin and desperate. A neighbor passed by and stopped short when he saw him standing there, relaxed, alert, not wrapped in layers of exhaustion. "You look awake," the man said cautiously. He smiled, small and private. "Slept fine." The neighbor glanced past him into the cabin, then up toward the ceiling. "Up there?" He nodded. The man shook his head slowly, disbelief battling curiosity. "Floor was frozen solid in my place this morning. So was mine," he said. "Still is." The neighbor frowned, trying to reconcile that. "Then how?" He didn't explain. He did to need to. He closed the door gently, climbed the ladder one more time, and sat on the edge of his attic bed, feeling the warmth gather around him again. For the first time all winter, the cold had lost its advantage. By the fourth day, the difference had stopped feeling like a surprise and started feeling like a fact, one of those facts, so solid it rearranges everything else around it. He no longer climbed the ladder with hesitation. His hands knew the rungs now, his feet found their place without looking, and the attic no longer felt like an experiment balanced on luck. It felt like a room, even if it was one anyone else would recognize. The thermometer became his quiet witness. He dehung it from a nail driven into a joist near the mattress, close enough that he could read it without sitting up. Every night before sleep, he checked it. Every morning before climbing down, he checked it again. The numbers stayed stubbornly consistent, even when the wind screamed harder or the fire burned lower than he'd planned. The air up here held steady in a way the rest of the cabin never did. Down below, the second thermometer told a different story. He tied it to the leg of the table, low enough that it brushed the floor when the cord slackened. The red line dipped lower every morning, sometimes flirting with numbers that made his breath catch. The floorboards were so cold they rang faintly when struck, as if the wood itself had turned brittle. He started wearing gloves indoors when he cooked, not because he was cold everywhere, just because his hands dropped into that lower layer of air whenever he reached for anything. The moment his fingers rose again, the sting faded. It was like living in two climates stacked on top of each other, separated by nothing but height. The absurdity of it made him shake his head more than once. On the fifth morning, he carried a mug of coffee up the ladder, something he'd never attempted before. The steam curled upward, hit the roof boards, and flattened, lingering instead of vanishing. He took a careful sip, leaning back against the beam, and realized his shoulders were relaxed. Not braced. Not hunched. Outside, the temperature dropped again overnight. The kind of drop that made sound travel farther, that sharpened edges and quieted everything else. He could hear axes splitting wood from across the valley, each strike echoing like a gunshot. He knew what that meant, people burning through reserves faster than they liked to admit. Mid-morning, a knock came at the door. He opened it to find two neighbors this time, both bundled heavily, breath steaming. Their eyes flicked past him immediately, scanning the cabin, noting what hadn't he changed. Same stove, same walls, same thin window. "You got a minute?" one asked, already stepping inside. They did to wait for permission. They never did, not really. The cold made people bold that way. He closed the door behind them, cutting off the wind. One of them stomped his boots, then frowned. "It is cold as hell down here," he said. He nodded. "It is." They looked at him, then up, following his gaze instinctively toward the ceiling. The ladder leaned in its usual place, worn already from use. "You really sleeping up there?" the other asked. "Every night." The first man laughed, but it came out thinner than before. "You darn look like you've been freezing." "I haven't, tea." That got their attention. They moved closer to the ladder, one of them reaching out, fingers brushing a rung. He did. Stop them. There was no point. "Go on," he said. "Climb." They exchanged a look, then one shrugged and went first. He climbed slowly, awkward in his heavy coat, stopping halfway. He lifted a hand, palm up, feeling the air. "Well?" the man below asked. The climber's brow furrowed. He moved his hand higher, then higher still, until his head reached the level of the platform. His posture changed immediately, subtle but unmistakable. Shoulders dropped. Breath slowed. "I'll be damned," he muttered. He climbed the rest of the way up and sat on the edge of the platform, boots dangling. "It's not warm," he said carefully. "But it's not cold either." The other man did to wait. He climbed up too, crowding the small space, ducking his head. For a moment, neither spoke. They just sat there, hands open, faces turned slightly upward as if listening to something only they could hear. Down below, the stove ticked faintly, its warmth already spent. They climbed down eventually, quieter than when they arrived. The first man rubbed his hands together, thoughtful. "How much extra wood you burning?" "Less," he said. That earned him a sharp look. That dawn makes sense. Heat was already here, he replied. I just stopped sleeping under it. They left not long after, without laughing. Outside, he heard them talking in low voices, words carried thinly through the cold air. He did need to catch them to know what they were saying. The idea had lodged itself now. It would spread whether he wanted it to or not. That night, the wind came hard. It slammed into the cabin in waves, rattling the door, forcing cold air through every imperfect seam. He banked the fire early, knowing it would, tea last, and climbed the ladder with his blanket pulled tight around his shoulders. The attic welcomed him like it always did now. The warmth felt earned, accumulated over hours of rising heat that had nowhere else to go. He lay down, listening to the storm rage beneath him, feeling the strange comfort of being above it. Sometime after midnight, a loud crack jolted him awake. He sat up instantly, heart pounding, scanning the roof boards for movement. Another crack followed, sharper this time, then a dull thud. Snow sliding. Ice breaking loose. The cabin shuddered but held. He waited, tense, but nothing else came. The attic remained steady, the boards beneath him unmoved. He exhaled slowly and lay back down, hand resting flat on the wood, feeling its solid resistance. Below him, the floor groaned as the temperature dropped further. He slept again. Morning revealed the damage winter had done overnight. A tree limb lay snapped near the path. Snowdrifts piled high against the cabin walls. The sky held that brittle blue that meant more cold was coming. Not less. He stepped outside briefly, boots crunching, breath sharp. The cabin looked unchanged, unimpressive, almost fragile against the white landscape. No one would guess what it held inside. Back indoors, he climbed the ladder once more, bringing the lower thermometer with him this time. He wanted to be sure. He hung it beside the other and waited, sitting cross-legged on the platform, watching the red line creep upward as it adjusted. The number settled. 50 degrees. He stared at it for a long time, not smiling, not celebrating, just absorbing the weight of it. This one's a trick. It one's luck. It was a truth that had been ignored for too long because it did. Fit the way people thought things were supposed to work. Later that afternoon, another knock came, then another, hours apart. Each time someone asked to see it. Each time they climbed the ladder, felt the air, went quiet. Some nodded, some frowned. A few scoffed, clinging to pride like it might keep them warm. By evening, the laughter was gone entirely. No one said it out loud, but he could feel the shift. The way people lingered longer than necessary. The way their eyes kept drifting upward even as they talked about other things. The way they left with plans forming behind their eyes. That night, alone again, he lay in his attic bed and listened to the wind fade. The cabin settled, tired but intact. Warmth pooled gently around him, faithful now, predictable. For the first time since building the place, he felt like the cabin was no longer fighting winter. It had learned how to live with it. Winter arrived the way it always did here, not with drama, but with commitment. It did announce itself in a single storm or a sudden whiteout. It simply settled in and refused to leave. The cold deepened day by day, layering itself over the valley until even familiar sounds felt muted, dulled by frost and distance. Trees stopped creaking and started cracking. Snow stopped sparkling and turned hard, almost metallic underfoot. Down in town, the change was immediate. Chimney smoke thickened, rising straight into the still air. People began moving differently, shoulders hunched, steps quicker, conversations shorter. Winter wasn't something you talked about anymore, was something you endured. In his cabin, life shifted quietly. He stopped trying to make the floor livable. That decision alone changed everything. No more dragging blankets across the boards during the day, no more hovering near the stove to steal warmth back from the air. The lower half of the cabin became what it naturally wanted to be, cold, heavy, still. A place for boots, storage, work. A buffer between him and the frozen ground. Above, life continued. Each evening followed the same rhythm now. He split a modest amount of firewood, far less than before, and fed the stove just enough to take the edge off. The fire didn't roar anymore. It glowed. It existed without demanding constant attention. When the light faded and shadows climbed the walls, he climbed the ladder, carrying with him only what he needed. Up there, the warmth was patient. It did rush to meet him. It did flare and vanish like stove heat did. It lingered, collected over hours, layered gently beneath the roof boards. The closer he lay to the ceiling, the more complete it felt, like settling into water that had already accepted your presence. One evening, he noticed something small but telling. He left a book up in the attic by accident, an old thing with a cracked spine and pages already yellowed. When he picked it up, the cover was stiff. The pages did resist when he turned them. Down below, paper curled and snapped like dry leaves. Up here, it stayed soft. When he understood fully, this one's just about sleeping warmer. It was about reclaiming a space Winter had never been challenged to give back. News traveled fast when people were cold. By midweek, the laughter had been replaced by a kind of wary interest. Neighbors stopped pretending they were just passing by. They came with excuses, borrowing tools, asking about firewood, checking on him, but their eyes always went to the letter. One afternoon, a woman arrived with her young son, both bundled tight. The boy, his cheeks were red with cold, his nose running. She didn't say much at first, just stood near the stove, rubbing her hands together. "He wakes up crying at night," she said, eventually nodding toward her son. "Says his feet hurt." He did respond immediately. He set the kettle on, poured hot water into cups, handed them over. Then he tilted his head toward the ladder. "Want to feel something?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. He climbed first, showing her where to place her feet, how to duck her head. She followed, awkward but careful, lifting her son up after her. The boy laughed the moment his head cleared the platform. Not a big laugh, just a soft, surprised sound. "It's not cold," he said. The woman froze, hand still gripping the ladder rung. She lifted her free hand, felt the air, then slowly sat down beside her child. Her shoulders sagged, the tension draining from her face in a way that made him look away. It felt too private, like watching someone realize they'd been holding their breath for weeks. She didn't ask how it worked. She did argue. She just nodded once, firmly, as if committing something to memory. That night, the temperature plunged further. He woke briefly around dawn, not from cold but from silence. The kind of silence that meant the world outside had locked itself in ice. No wind. No distant chopping, no animals, just stillness, heavy and absolute. Curious, he climbed down and stepped outside. The cold hit him like a wall. It stole the air from his lungs, made his eyes water instantly. Snow underfoot rang like glass. He took 3 steps and stopped, unwilling to push it further. From his doorway he could see lights on in several houses already. Smoke poured thick and desperate from chimneys. Someone had stacked furniture outside their place, likely preparing to burn it. He went back in and climbed the ladder, retreating upward into warmth that felt almost defiant now. That day, he noticed he was as tired. Winter fatigue had always crept in, by now bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep fixed. But his mind felt clear. His hands did shake as much. He moved with purpose instead of dragging himself from task to task. Heat did just keep you alive, he realized. It kept you human. By evening, the knock came again. This time it was 3 men. They did waste time with pleasantries. "Show us," one said. He did. They climbed, one after the other, filling the small space with heavy coats and steam from their breath. They said very little, but their reactions spoke loudly enough. One cursed under his breath. Another shook his head slowly, as if offended by the simplicity of it. The third sat silently, staring at the roof boards, eyes unfocused. "You sleep here?" he asked finally. "Every night. With the fire that low, yes." They climbed down and stood around the stove, which barely glowed now. One of them kicked at the floor, scowling as cold bit through his boot. "My place burned twice the wood last night," he muttered. No one laughed. They left with more questions than they asked, their footsteps crunching thoughtfully away into the snow. That night, as the wind returned and rattled the walls, he lay awake longer than usual, not from discomfort, but from awareness. The attic felt different now. He could sense the heat moving, slow and inevitable, rising from the dying fire, pooling around him, staying. Below him, the cabin surrendered to cold without resistance. He realized something then that surprised him. He wasn't fighting winter anymore. He wasn't trying to dominate it with bigger fires or thicker walls. He was exhausting himself, proving he could endure more pain than the season could inflict. He was cooperating. The idea felt almost dangerous in its simplicity. In the days that followed, signs of change appeared everywhere. Ladders leaned against walls where they hadn't before. Boards disappeared from sheds. People talked about ceiling height and beam spacing instead of complaining about the cold. Some failed attempts collapsed quickly, abandoned in frustration. Others succeeded quietly, without announcement. No one left anymore. One morning he found a note tucked into his doorframe. No name. Just a simple sentence, written stiff-like. "Did tea wake up cold last night? Thank you." He folded it carefully and tucked it into a drawer. Winter tightened its grip, but something had shifted beneath it. Not loudly, not all at once, just enough to matter. And every night, as he climbed the ladder and settled into the warm pocket beneath the roof, he felt it. The strange, steady satisfaction of knowing the cold no longer decided everything. By the time the valley reached the heart of winter, the change was no longer subtle. It showed itself in the small, practical details people usually did notice until something went wrong. Firewood stacks that normally shrank at an alarming pace lasted longer. Chimney smoke rose thinner, steadier, less frantic. The sound of nighttime coughing drifting through the cold air faded, replaced by longer stretches of silence that spoke of uninterrupted sleep. He noticed it first in the mornings. People moved differently now when they passed his cabin. Less hurried, less brittle. Shoulders weren't as tight against their ears. Conversations lingered a few seconds longer than before. Winter hadn't. He loosened its grip, but it had lost some of its power to grind everyone down at once. The attic bed stopped being a curiosity and became a reference point. Someone would mention a cold night, and another would respond, "Did you try sleeping higher?" As if the idea had always been there, waiting to be remembered. People compared ladder angles and beam spacing the way they used to compare stove brands. Arguments broke out not about whether it worked, but about how best to do it. Not everyone succeeded. A few rushed their builds, trusting hope more than structure. One platform sagged dangerously after a week and had to be torn down. Another collapsed entirely during the day, when no one was on it, scattering boards and bruising pride. No one mocked them. Everyone understood now that Winter punished carelessness without needing an audience. He helped when he could. Not with grand instructions or lectures, but with quiet advice given over cups of steaming water. He showed people where to test beams, how to listen for complaints in the wood, how to trust old boards over new ones that hadn't. T-Yet learned how to bend. He never framed it as genius. He framed it as attention. One evening, an older man came by alone. He stood in the doorway longer than necessary, hat in his hands. "I ain't slept a full night in weeks," he said, eyes fixed on the floor. "My bones don't warm up anymore." He did answer right away. He gestured toward the ladder. They climbed slowly. The man moved carefully, stiff with age and cold, every rung a small negotiation. When his head rose into the attic space, he froze, hands still gripping the beam. He did speak for a long time. Finally he exhaled. "Feels like my old house," he said softly, before it burned. They sat together in silence for a while, two men sharing warmth without ceremony. When the man left, he did say thank you. He did need to. His posture had already said it for him. Winter deepened. The cold reached a point where metal stuck to skin and breath hurt. Tools left outside became useless. Snow squeaked underfoot with every step. This was the stretch that usually broke people, when novelty and determination ran out and only endurance remained. In his cabin, routines held. The stove burned low and steady. The ladder stayed where it belonged. The attic became not just a sleeping place but a refuge. On the worst nights, he found himself climbing up earlier, drawn by the promise of warmth that didn't demand anything in return. One night, the storm came without warning. Wind howled down from the ridge, slamming into buildings, tearing loose snow and ice. The temperature dropped so fast it felt personal, as if Winter had chosen that moment to remind everyone who was in charge. Power failed first. Lights across the valley blinked out, plunging homes into sudden darkness. Then the furnaces fell silent. Electric heaters died where they stood, useless and cold. Panic followed, quiet but sharp. Doors opened. Voices called across the dark. People checked on one another with flashlights and stiff fingers. In his cabin, the stove glowed faintly, indifferent to the grid's collapse. He fed it a single log and climbed the ladder, listening as the storm battered the walls below him. The attic held. Wind screamed beneath him, but the warmth stayed pooled under the roof, stubborn and calm. He lay there, wrapped in a blanket, feeling the structure vibrate but not fail. Morning revealed the damage. Branches littered the paths. Snowdrifts blocked doors. A few roofs sagged under the weight of ice. People emerged pale and exhausted, many having slept poorly or not at all. Those who had built attic beds looked different. They moved slower but steadier, eyes clearer, hands less shaky. They spoke quietly, confidently, as if they crossed a line others were still struggling toward. No one said it out loud, but everyone saw it. Later that day, a small group gathered near his cabin. They did knock. They did need to. "We were thinking about making it standard," one of them said. "In new builds, higher sleeping space, better use of heat." He considered that, watching his breath cloud in the cold air below the attic line. "Just don't forget why it works," he said, "and don't rush it." They nodded. As night fell again, he climbed the ladder, feeling the familiar shift as warmth welcomed him back. Below him, the floor froze hard and unyielding. Above, heat waited patiently, ready to do what it always had. Winter still ruled the land, but it no longer ruled how people slept. The storm that followed arrived with no warning and no mercy. There had been others that winter-hard nights, screaming winds, days when the sun felt ornamental, but this one carried a different weight. The air went unnaturally still in the hours before it had hit, as if the valley itself were holding its breath. Smoke from chimneys rose straight up, thin and brittle, before vanishing into a sky the color of iron. He felt it in his bones long before the first gust struck. By late afternoon, he'd already finished what little work could be done outside. Tools froze to the touch. Snow creaked instead of crunching. Animals vanished. He banked the stove early, fed it carefully, and checked the ladder twice before night fell. There was a tension in the cabin, subtle but undeniable, like the boards were listening. When the wind came, it came sideways. It slammed into the walls hard enough to make the cabin shudder, rattling the window, forcing cold air through seams he thought sealed. Snow hissed against the roof in sheets, then hardened into ice that scraped and groaned as it piled up. The sound was constant, a relentless roar that made the cabin feel smaller by the minute. He climbed the ladder with deliberate care, not rushing, not hesitating. Up in the attic, the warmth was already there, faint but loyal. He pulled his blanket tight and lay still, listening as the storm battered the world below him. Somewhere in the night, the power failed across the valley. He knew it instantly, not from a sound, but from the absence of one. The faint hum that traveled through the ground on winter nights vanished, leaving behind a deeper, heavier silence beneath the wind. Electric lights went dark. Furnaces died. The valley dropped into a kind of cold darkness that only happened when modern things stopped working all at once. He lay awake, not from fear, but from awareness. Down below, his stove ticked softly as it cooled, giving up its last stored warmth. He knew that by morning, the floor would be unforgiving, the air down there sharp enough to sting the lungs. He also knew where he was. The attic held. Heat, patient and stubborn, lingered beneath the roof boards, collecting what little warmth remained and refusing to surrender it to the storm. He shifted slightly, testing the air, and felt it cling to him like a living thing. Elsewhere in the valley, people weren't so still. Doors opened in the dark. Voices called out, thin and strained. Flashlights flickered through blowing snow as neighbors checked on one another, shouting over the wind. Some tried to restart furnaces that would not respond. Others dragged out old kerosene heaters, discovering too late that fuel had frozen or run out. Cold has a way of stripping away certainty. Inside his cabin, the storm roared, but the structure held. The roof creaked under the weight of snow, beams groaning in protest, but nothing shifted. He reached out once and pressed his palm against the wood, feeling its steady resistance, grounding himself in its solidity. Sometime before dawn, he slept. Not deeply, not easily, but enough. When morning came, it brought no immediate relief. The sky remained low and gray, the wind easing but never truly leaving. Snow lay piled in unnatural drifts, sculpted by the storm into shapes that looked almost deliberate. Branches snapped and littered the paths. A fence lay flattened under the weight of ice. He climbed down slowly, bracing himself for the cold that waited below. It hit him instantly, brutal and sharp, forcing a hiss from his teeth. He moved quickly, fed the stove, waited for the first hesitant warmth to return, then stepped outside. The valley looked wounded. Smoke was scarce now, thinner than usual, rising only from a few chimneys. Some houses sat dark and silent, their occupants having fled to neighbors or barns that held heat better than their homes. Others showed signs of desperate improvisation, windows covered with blankets, doors sealed with whatever could be found. He did, to need to ask how the night had gone. By midday, people began to appear at his door, not all at once, one at a time. Some brought news. Some brought questions. Some just needed to stand somewhere that felt less hostile than their own homes. Those who had built attic beds spoke quietly among themselves, comparing the night. None of them claimed comfort. None pretended the storm hadn't been terrifying, but they had slept. That fact alone separated them from the rest. One man stood near the stove, rubbing his hands, eyes unfocused. "Never thought sleeping closer to the roof would save me," he said finally. "It wasn't the roof," he replied. "It was the heat." The man nodded slowly, as if filing that away somewhere deep. That evening, as the valley struggled back toward some version of normal, he climbed the ladder again. The attic welcomed him with its familiar, muted warmth. He lay there listening to the diminished wind, the cabin settling back into itself. The storm had passed, but winter remained. And now everyone understood something they hadn't before. Survival ones, always about adding more. Sometimes it was about moving to where what you already had could finally work. Spring arrived so quietly that no one trusted it at first. The snow did vanish in a rush. It retreated in patches, pulling back from the dark earth the way an animal backs out of a fight it isn't sure it's won. Ice loosened its grip reluctantly, cracking at night, dripping during the day, never fully committing to either state. The valley remained cautious. Winter had taught everyone what happened when you believed too early. In his cabin, the change announced itself differently. He noticed it one morning when he climbed down from the attic and did immediately feel punished for it. The floor was still cold, but it no longer felt alive. It did bite. It waited. That alone felt like mercy. The attic bed remained where it was, unchanged, uncelebrated. He continued sleeping there, long after the nights softened, long after the stove became optional instead of essential. Habit had replaced necessity, and trust had replaced fear. Even when warmth spread more evenly through the cabin, the space beneath the roof still felt right, like a place earned rather than borrowed. Around the valley, other cabins bore quiet evidence of the winter that had passed. Ladders remained leaning against walls even when they were no longer strictly needed. Platforms stayed intact, blankets folded neatly at their edges. People had reorganized their homes without fully realizing it, shifting the way they thought about space and warmth and survival. What had started as a reaction to cold had become something more permanent. No one laughed, now not even in memory. When people spoke of the attic beds, they did speak of cleverness or invention. They spoke of rest, of nights that hadn't broken them, of mornings they'd woken clear-headed instead of hollowed out. The story lost its sharp edges and became something quieter, almost ordinary. That was how real changes always arrived. One afternoon, as the ground softened enough to walk without careful planning, he stood outside his cabin and watched water drip steadily from the roof. Each drop darkened the soil beneath it, a slow, patient rhythm that marked time better than any calendar. The ladder stood just inside the door, visible through the open frame. A man approached along the path, moving slowly but steadily. He carried no tools, no questions written on his face. Just curiosity that no longer felt defensive. "Mind if I look at it again?" the man asked, nodding toward the ceiling. He stepped aside. They climbed together, careful out of habit even though the danger had passed. Up in the attic, sunlight filtered faintly through the tiny gaps in the roof boards, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the air. "It does feel the same now," the man said. "No," he agreed, "but it remembers." The man smiled at that, understanding more than he needed explained. They climbed back down without another word. As the days lengthened, people began repairing what winter had damaged. Roofs were cleared, fences rebuilt, paths reopened. The valley exhaled slowly, as if releasing something it had been holding tight for months. He helped where he could, lending time more than strength. He listened to stories people hadn't. Wanted to tell during the cold months' nights spent awake, quiet fear, moments when they considered leaving. These stories surfaced now, not as complaints, but as acknowledgments. Winter had tested everyone. Some had bent, some had nearly broken, but many had endured in a way they hadn't. Before. Late one evening, he climbed into the attic bed and lay there watching the light fade. The roof boards glowed faintly amber before dark claimed them completely. The air felt gentle now, neither warm nor cold, just present. He thought about how small the change had been. No new materials, no grand design. No battle won through force, just a decision to stop fighting the way everyone else fought, and to notice something that had always been happening quietly above their heads. Heat rises. People forget that because it feels too simple to matter. Below him, the cabin rested easily now, no longer locked in a constant struggle against the cold. The floor would warm in time, the walls would dry. Summer would come whether anyone asked for it or not. But the attic bed would stay, not because it was needed anymore, but because it had proven something. That survival wasn't always about endurance. That sometimes the smartest thing a person could do was move not forward, not outward, but upward into the place where the world already wanted to help. As darkness settled fully, he closed his eyes. Winter was over. What it had taught them would remain.